Hi, welcome to Cabrillo National Monument, your national park. I'm Sam Wins, conservation biologist and science educator for the Great Basin Institute and Cabrillo National Monument. And I'm here today to teach you about how we preserve and protect. It is the National Park Service's mission to preserve and protect our cultural, historical, and natural resources. And as a biologist, it's my mission to preserve our natural resources, which means every species of native plant and animal that lives here at Cabrillo. But of course, we look at these different species in different ways, right? This means we go out and we study in what's called inventory and monitoring projects. But it wouldn't make any sense to study, say, an octopus the same way we study snakes. So today we're going to talk about something called herpetofauna monitoring. Wow, that's a big word, I know. Basically, that's how we study our reptiles and amphibians at the park. So how we herpetofauna monitor is through a device called a pitfall array. And there's basically three components to that device. So first you have your drop bucket or pitfall, and you can see right below me here. It's basically a bucket that is buried in the ground up to the lip. Next, we have the second component, which is this guide fence, which you can see right here. And I'll talk about the guide fence in just a minute. And the third component, we need to go on a little walkabout. The third component is actually this device right here. This is a snake trap. It's basically a tube of chicken wire with two cones at the end of it. And I'm going to explain what all of these things do here in just a moment. First, we have the drop bucket. Now, as you can see, this drop bucket is currently closed, and it remains closed for 3 weeks out of every month. But for one of those weeks of the month, we open up the bucket, like so, set it open on top of its little legs, which creates a gap, if you can see right here, a gap between the ground and the top of the bucket. And that gap is so little creatures can fall in. And then we come back every day of that week that the bucket is open and we see who have we caught. But there are some other components inside. Let's see what we've got inside here. First, we have these little PVC tubes. Now these are actually a place for creatures to hide in, right? Because oftentimes you catch more than one creature in these buckets. Sometimes they might be foes of one another, right? Maybe you've got a predator and its prey, and so they need a place to hide from each other, right? So you've created little tubes there for them to hide in. Next, we've just got this fancy little cup with some cotton batting in it. Now, even though these arrays are made to catch reptiles and amphibians, of course we catch a lot of other things too, because there's lots of little creatures that scurry along the ground, tons of insects, right? Tons of small mammals. And in fact, that's what this cup is for. It's for the small mammals. Keeps them nice and warm at night. This little cotton batting acts almost like a little blanket. And I always know if I've caught a small mammal in this array, if I come back and the cotton's kind of out a little bit like this, I know there's a little buddy hiding down at the bottom of the cup, tucked in, all nice and snuggy. Lastly, we have a sponge. Now the sponge is usually soaking wet, but I didn't want to handle a soaking wet sponge today, so it's dry. But it's wet because we do have one salamander species at the park, the garden slender salamander. And a salamander, being an amphibian, needs to keep its skin nice and moist. So we have a nice wet sponge for the salamander to stay wet in overnight. Now you might be wondering how we actually get these creatures in the bucket. And this is where our guide fence comes into play. At the end of each one of these fences is another bucket. So let's say you're a little lizard and you come along and you run up against this fence. Which direction are you going to move? Well, you're probably going to take the path of least resistance, right? It takes less energy to do that. So you're either going to run to the left or to the right. Either way, run it along the fence, and boop, right into the bucket. That's how we catch these creatures in our pitfall arrays. Once we come back and see that we've caught some cool creatures, we're going to take some data on those creatures. But first, we need to identify them, right? Because there's many different species of reptiles and amphibians around the world, and it wouldn't give us much information if we just wrote down we caught a lizard. So once we've identified the species, then we take some data. The first thing we do is we measure that animal. Now, depending if we have a snake or a lizard, we're going to use a couple of these very fancy tools, a ruler for lizards, or a measuring tape for snakes. Now, of course, we use the metric side because we are scientists, right? Then we'll record that data. Next, we take their weight, and we do that with this calibrated scale. Let me get that out and show you. Now this scale clips onto something, but of course we're not going to clip this to an animal. It could harm the animal, right? So what we do instead is we take a bag, we stick our animal in the bag, and then we weigh the animal and the bag together. Let me show you. Pretend we've got a lizard or a snake in this bag. And voila, we have a weight. However, that's not just the weight of the animal, right? That is the weight of the animal plus the bag. So what we've done is we've weighed this bag ahead of time, and we'll just subtract that from the total weight to get the exact weight of the animal. And we record that. And then we'll also write down information, like if it's a juvenile or an adult, or if we can sex the animal, that is, tell if it's a male or a female, we'll write that down. We'll write down if it's injured, if it has mites. Maybe it's a pregnant female. It's what we call being gravid. We'll write that down, right? And then once we've done all of that, we mark the animal so that we know if it's the same individual that we catch year after year, and we let it go. Now that we have all of this information, we can compare this information year after year, and it can tell us how the population is changing over time. Because of course we can't catch every single reptile and amphibian, right? So we get a sampling, and then we can use math to extrapolate what's going on in that population at large. The information, the data that we have taken, can tell us how many individuals there are and if that population is increasing or decreasing, right? Which may give us an indication of the health of its environment or some sort of problem it might be facing. We can tell overall size of the population and weight, whether that might be changing. For instance, if the weight is going down of a particular lizard species, that might give us an indication that there's some sort of problem. Maybe there aren't enough resources for that lizard, not enough food, what it likes to eat, right? So this is all information on how we can preserve and protect these animals for the long term. Now you might be wondering, what happens if you catch a really large snake? Because we do, of course, occasionally catch really large snakes. Won't that snake just slither right out of the bucket? Yes, in fact it will, which is why we have our snake trap, our third component to these pitfall arrays. Now the snake trap is just a tube of chicken wire with two cones at the end, which I mentioned earlier. And this is how it works. The snake trap is laid down along the guide fence. So again, if that snake comes up to that guide fence, it's going to take the path of least resistance. So it slithers along the guide fence and goes whoop right into the snake trap. It's really easy for the snake to get into the snake trap because we have the wide part of the cone at the end, right? It is flush with the ground, easy for the snake to get in, but once they're in, it's very hard for the snake to get out. And that is in large part because it's got the skinny part of the cone inside, right? So it's just this little opening that they have to navigate towards. And that opening is elevated off the ground. So it's really hard for the snake to zero in on that to escape. Once you've got your snake in your snake trap, you need to get it out, right? So that you can take that data on it. So what you do is you tilt the snake trap, which usually forces the snake to kind of go down to one side. Then you open up one end of the trap. So you unclip the cones. All right, remove the cone. Stick the end of the bag over this open end now. If you can get it without catching. Okay. Make sure that bag is secure, and then dump your snake right into that bag. Then you can close the end of the bag, go about weighing your snake, pulling your snake out to measure it, and voila, you've got some data on a snake. I hope you enjoyed learning about how we monitor our reptiles and amphibians here at Cabrillo National Monument, and about how the Park Service as a whole performs its inventory and monitoring projects. See you next time. Bye.